Hi, I'm Tetreault with Global Sugar Art, and today I'd like to show you my method of covering a cake with rolled fondant. There are many methods out there, and nobody is necessarily right or wrong. Everybody just has their own method. So I'd like to share with you how I do it, which I think is pretty easy. So I started with about 1.5 pounds of rolled fondant here. This happens to be satin ice. Before you ever cover a cake with fondant, you have to knead the fondant. All the fondants have a gum additive to it, and you can liken this to a piece of chewing gum that you're pulling out of a package, and it's sort of hard and brittle. But once you chew it a little bit, it becomes very pliable and soft, and it's the same thing with fondant. So warming it up just by kneading it in the heat of your hands will bring it to a consistency that makes it easier to roll out and to cover the cake. It's also a good workout. So here we go. I have a silicone mat. You can use the plain countertop if you choose to. Just make sure you have a nice, clean, smooth surface. That's the important part. A wooden board wouldn't really work well because you'd have little grooves in it and little nicks that would show. So you really want a very smooth top. Now, some people recommend putting a little bit of shortening all over this or spraying it with Pam or something like that. I don't recommend doing that. I've seen other people sort of have a whole pile of cornstarch or sugar. That's not necessary either. I use a mixture of half cornstarch and half powdered sugar, or sometimes I just use powdered sugar alone. But I never use just cornstarch. Cornstarch all by itself will draw the moisture out of the fondant. You'll end up with a dry piece of fondant that will crack around the edges, and you get that what they call elephant skin. It's sort of a characteristic wrinkling of the fondant when you're putting it on the cake. So here we go. I'm just putting maybe a tablespoon of sugar on the table. I'm going to start with a large rolling pin. These are the plastic rolling pins. The trick with fondant is to keep it moving. You don't want to allow it to stick to the board. So see how easy that moves around? I haven't added any more sugar at all. Now, for those of you who don't have really strong backs or shoulders and you're covering a lot of cakes, you'll find this exhausting and really hard on your shoulders and your arms. So I'm going to show you a little bit of a trick. The nice part about fondant is it stretches. We're going to use that stretchability to our advantage. So now I'm taking a small rolling pin. I'm going to put just a little bit of sugar on top, and I'm going to use the small rolling pin, whoops, that has to stay there, and I'm going to push from the center to the outside. So rather than rolling the fondant, I'm actually now stretching it. I'm pushing it out. This requires a lot less force on your shoulders and your back and your arms. You can just do it a little bit at a time. Every once in a while, just pick it up. I see it's starting to just adhere a little bit. So I'm going to put just a little bit of sugar on there, just to keep that nice and loose. Now, most of the time, you want to get your fondant down between 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch in thickness. Okay, that's getting there. That's pretty close now. As it gets larger, you can do the same thing with the large pin. Start in the middle and work your way out. So if you have a big 14 or 16 inch cake to do, it makes it a lot easier. Okay, I think I am ready to cover my cake. So I have here a cake. I put the cake on the same size board as the cake. This is an 8-inch cake. It's sitting on an 8-inch board, and I have it on a turntable. Now, the cake comes straight down to the side. There is no board underneath it. Now, this is a nice little turntable that I have, but you can do the same thing with like a soup can. Think of like maybe a large, they call them number 5 cans that you would get stewed tomatoes in or something. Or maybe a tall juice can. and just set the cake right on top of that. So I have a smoother. This is a fondant smoother. I'm going to go over the top of this and smooth the fondant. Now I'm ready to drape it over the cake. So you have to measure your sides and your top. I have an 8-inch cake with 4-inch sides. So I have 4 and 8 is 12 and 4 is 16. So I have to have at least a 16-inch circle to successfully cover this cake. So always measure before you put it on. So from here, I'm just going to lightly roll that up. I'm going to go to the cake, make sure that it's completely covered, and then just drop the fondant right on top of the cake. Now the first thing I do is I take my smoother and I go over the top to get rid of any air bubbles. And then I'm going to use the palm of my hand, which is warm, and I'm just going to go right around the edge, and I'm going to adhere that fondant right to the top. Okay. Now, if you have a lot of fondant and it's hanging a long way down, you're going to want to cut some of that off because you don't want the weight of the fondant pulling on the sides of the cake and then splitting this up at the top. Having the cake propped up on a can or a turntable like this allows me now to separate the fondant. I sort of open these folds up. I'm not going to push down, I'm going to push up. So I'm going to use my hand and I'm going to go in an upward motion. And the reason I'm not pulling down is I don't want to put any stress on the top right here. That's what causes cracking and splitting of your fondant. So always work in a motion going up. And I'm going to go right around the cake and I'm going to adhere that fondant at the top part. And then from there I slowly go around the cake and just adhere that. Just pull the folds apart. It's just like working with fabric if you've ever done any sewing. Just pull the folds apart and just adhere it to the cake. Go right down to the bottom. There. Now I'm going to cut off the excess. But I left about an inch skirt down at the bottom. So my top is done. This is where it's helpful to have two different fondant smoothers. And they can be the same, it doesn't matter. I just happen to have two different ones here. You can hold one side because you don't want to putting your hand in there. If you put your hand in there to hold the cake, you're going to push right into the cake and you're going to leave a handprint. So use another smoother. And just go in an up and down motion first, so you really get this well adhered to the cake. Okay, and now I'm just going to go on the sides like this. I'm just hanging on to the turntable in the bottom and going in a circular motion. There. And the last part is just simply taking a knife and cutting along the bottom edge. And that's all there is to it. It's very easy. The tricks here are don't use too much powdered sugar or cornstarch. Use a blend of the two or just use the sugar. Don't use cornstarch alone. Make sure that you knead your fondant well. You've brought it up to room temperature, especially if you're in a northern climate in the wintertime and you've kept your fondant in a cool place. It's got to come up to room temperature before it will work well. If it's cold, it's just too hard to work with. Likewise, if you're in a southern climate or in a hot kitchen or a hot room, really warm fondant can be very sticky and very, very stretchy. It can be difficult to work with. So any fondant that you use is going to be temperamental as far as temperature. It works best if you can keep the temperature probably in the mid 70s or low 70s. Roll it out with a nice smooth rolling pin, and if you have any air bubbles, and on this cake I didn't really have any, but let's say I had a little air bubble here at the top when I was done. All you have to do is take a little straight pin, just push it in at an angle into the bubble, and then push the air out, and then use your smoother and just go right over the dot, and you can get rid of the little mark where the pin was. Works very, very well. Depending on the type of cake you have, you may have more air bubbles. Now, the best way to handle the cake so that you can cover this easily is to bake your cake, ice it, and then put it in the freezer for about 10 to 15 minutes. You don't want it frozen all the way through, because when you put your fondant on it, the fondant's going to freeze right to the cake and you're going to have a mess. But you want it firm enough so that you can push against it and smooth the fondant without crushing your cake. Remember that fondant was developed to be used on fruit cake, not on the soft cakes that like Duncan Hines or Betty Crocker sort of cake mixes that we have in the United States. So if you're making your own cake, a pound cake or a firmer textured cake is going to work better than a really light cake. But you can always overcome the light cakes by placing them in the freezer for a little bit first. I hope you enjoyed my tutorial, and give fondant a try. It really is a joy to work with, and the decorating possibilities are absolutely endless. You just got to get this one thing down really well first. Thank you for watching.